Hello, this is Todd Luck, and this is a review of a Tarzan comic I dislike so much it made me drop the series back in the 90s for 4 months, and then I started collecting it again for the next plot line. This is a review of Tarzan le Monstre. And so my personal story on this one is that in 1997, I was collecting the Tarzan series. I enjoyed the first two plot lines, as we've seen in my reviews. But then I got to this 6-issue story arc that opened up with this two-parter, and I didn't like part one. And when I finished the second issue, I disliked it so much, I actually returned it to the comic shop. I actually had some comics in my box I wanted to get rid of. I had 3 New Universe comics and 3 Star comics that I'd gotten as a kid in multi-packs. And so I took those in this issue and sold them back to the comic shop. And out of that bunch, the only ones I regret selling are the Star comics because they're actually worth a little bit of money now. And the artwork on that Strawberry Shortcake #1 was absolutely gorgeous. And I know what you're saying, that sometimes 2 issues isn't enough to see how well a creative team is going to do on a series. And I agree with you. And I used to give comics a much longer leeway when I was younger. Like when I started collecting comics in the late 80s, right? Comics were like 75 cents or $1. And so I would let them go for much longer to give them a chance. But by the time I got to 1997, comics were $2 to $2.50 for a regular issue. Tarzan, on the other hand, was $2.95. This was a very premium price, and so for me to pay this, I had to be absolutely in love with the series to be able to buy it for that much as a cash-strapped teenager. And so for this review, I've repurchased this issue and reread it, and I've also purchased the rest of the plot line. It's divided into 2-part stories, and so this is my first time reading those next 4 issues. And so this review will cover Tarzan issues 11 through 16. And so here are the creators for this plot line. They have some very European names that I doubt my poor American tongue will ever get right, so I'm not even going to try to pronounce them. So this plot line came about when the writer approached an editor at Dark Horse pitching a story about Tarzan's time and civilization in Tarzan of the Apes. There's a point at which he travels from Europe to America on his quest to be with Jane. And this is right after he's learned how to speak French and English and all that. And so during that time period, he meets historical figures and gets into conflict with classic literary monsters. So going back and looking at this plot line, I'm trying to approach this with an open mind. Maybe I was just too hasty when I was young. I mean, it is kind of an out there idea. 6 issues of Tarzan in civilization. I mean, they would have to have something really, really strong, some kind of really big opening to sell me on that concept. It's a 2-part story where he fights Phantom of the Opera. And so taking a look at the covers for the first 2 parts, they're by Bernie Wrightson, who is a masterful artist. He does a great job with the layout and the rendering of these covers, and they are what you would expect from Bernie Wrightson, but there's still Tarzan fighting Phantom of the Opera. Opening this up, this is what I'm greeted to on the interiors, and yeah, I am not impressed. It's just too much of a caricature and too stylized for this type of comic, at least in my opinion. But it does definitely get better in parts. So the story here is that Paul Darno falls in love with Christine, who is a character in Phantom of the Opera, and she is the diva of the opera house. After Paul talks about marrying her and taking her away from the opera, the Phantom bursts in and attacks Paul, and they get in a sword fight. The Phantom escapes with Christine, and Tarzan pursues him. And one thing I will say about the artist is that he does a great job with the backgrounds. I mean, he does a lot of really cool work with that. Another example of good background work as Tarzan pursues the Phantom through the theater. Issue 2 features a confrontation between Tarzan and the Phantom in his underground lair. And again, the artist puts in a lot of work into the backgrounds. It's just sometimes his rendering of people that I wish was a little bit different. And so the Phantom here just kind of comes off as lame. He just bursts into Christine's dressing room, spouting out melodramatic nonsense, kidnaps her, runs and manages to lose Tarzan in the theater. And then when they confront him, he just has this very like silly, childish motivation. The whole thing just feels very cheesy, and it doesn't work for me. Now, for this review, I have actually listened to all the audiobooks for the classic monsters that Tarzan faces in this plot line. And yes, Phantom of the Opera is actually a novel. I always thought it was a musical before I researched this review, but it is a novel. So in the novel, the Phantom is essentially a deformed incel who kidnaps Christine and tries to force her to marry him. But to my surprise, he's the precursor to the modern day supervillain. He's super smart. He has all these trapdoors and secret passages. He can get in and out of the theater without anyone knowing how he got there, which is why they think he's a ghost. He has an underground layer underneath the theater with an organ and a lake and all of this stuff. And he's got death traps for the heroes. He makes these melodramatic villain speeches, but he can also be an extraordinarily sympathetic character and tragic as well. And he's just very interesting, complex character. Unfortunately, none of that happened in this particular plot line, which is a shame. I will say the Phantom's fate in this two-parter is much kinder than what happened to him in the novel. So for fans of the character, that may be a draw. And, you know, I'm sure there is some crossover between people who like Phantom of the Opera and Tarzan. And so if you want to see these two meet, here you go. However, me personally, I still want to return this issue, and I'd still rather have my Strawberry Shortcake #1 back. All right, so for the next two-part plot line, Tarzan goes to New York and meets Frankenstein's monster in a two-parter called The Modern Prometheus. And this is my first time ever reading these comics. And so these covers are done by the great Mike Kaluta, and he does a good job. This one I particularly like. Now, he does use some artistic license. Nakima is not in here, but you can see him on the covers. But I like this one because it's just so unusual to see Tarzan in this kind of mad scientist laboratory. And adding the monkey in there is just an extra touch of strangeness that I kind of like. So in this plot line, Tarzan just happens to meet Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who is the creator of Sherlock Holmes, while in New York, and they team up for a good bit of the plot line. And they meet Nikola Tesla, the inventor, who invites them to his laboratory. When they go to the laboratory, it turns out Frankenstein's monster has broken in there to steal something. Probably the strangest part is where Tesla uses one of the machines to create this ball of electricity and then launches it at Frankenstein like it's a fireball in Street Fighter. Hadouken! But that's the only time that happens in the plotline. Unlike other comics, Nikola Tesla doesn't have any superpowers here. And so I don't want to spoil anything, but there is another character who wants the thing that was in Tesla's lab that Frankenstein was after. And that's really what the story is about. It's about Nikola Tesla and this other character who are trying to get the thing that Tesla has. Now, Frankenstein honestly barely appears in this storyline. He feels kind of like he was shoehorned in, and Tarzan doesn't appear all that much. Again, it feels more like Nikola Tesla's story than Tarzan's. So I think the reason why Frankenstein is not on the covers is that they do not show you what he looks like until the end of the second issue. And so I'm not going to spoil that for you, but I will say that this is Frankenstein, at least partially inspired by the movies, because he is a monster made from sewn together body parts. But it's also a different take on the character. He has a point of view and a motivation we haven't seen with Frankenstein before, at least I haven't seen. So if you're a fan of the character, it's always interesting to see different takes on Frankenstein. I will say the story idea here is much better than the first two-parter. The idea of using historical figures in a fictionalized way has become obviously very common in comics, and there are a lot of good stories that do come out of that, though I would say that I do enjoy those stories because they're good stories and not necessarily because they have Nikola Tesla with superpowers or something like that. Here, the story's just kind of okay, and again, Tarzan and Frankenstein just didn't feel like they even belonged here. And there's also a really weird mention of Pellucidar in here. For some reason, Tarzan knows about Pellucidar in 1909, which I don't think makes a whole lot of sense. All right, and so for the final two-parter, we have Tarzan versus Mr. Hyde in Tooth and Nail. And so these are two covers by the great Mark Schultz, and they are well rendered and I think well composed. But the unfortunate thing is I have a hard time telling who the characters are. I don't think Tarzan looks a whole lot like Tarzan, and Hyde doesn't look a whole lot like Hyde. And I can't even tell them apart on this cover except by the color of their shirt. So yeah, mixed bag with the covers. And so before I get into the comics, let me talk about the novel The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is what gave us, of course, Jekyll and Hyde. And so in that novel, Dr. Jekyll is an elderly man, and he has this strange idea to somehow unleash his evil side so it can go around and do bad things without his normal self feeling bad about it. And so he comes up with this kind of alchemist formula that he ingests, and it transforms him into his evil self, which of course is Mr. Hyde. Now, in the novel, Mr. Hyde is actually a small man. He's actually much smaller than Jekyll and younger. And Jekyll explains this by saying that probably it's because his evil self is less developed. He's always tried to be someone who's good, and so when he turns evil, his evil side is smaller. Now, what is it that makes Hyde evil is mostly left to the imagination. The book does say he has some kind of deformity to his face that makes him disturbing to look at, but no one can quite put their finger on exactly why. But there's just a sense that he's just this unnatural, evil creature that really, makes people's skin crawl when he's around them. As far as why he does that's actually evil is almost entirely left to the imagination. The only two specific things that we get in the novel is that he tramples a girl at the beginning and he beats a man to death with his cane at some point. But for the most part, whatever Hyde does when he goes out at night is completely unknown and completely left to the reader's imagination. So in this story, Hyde's evil takes the form of him killing or raping anything around him. The police in New York enlist Tarzan's help to track down this mysterious serial killer. Now, as you've seen, there's a bit more graphic violence than you're probably used to in a Tarzan novel. And there's also the oddity of this man grabbing this prostitute's breast on panel, followed by the implication that Hyde successfully raped this woman before killing her. Obviously, this is stuff we're not used to seeing in a Tarzan story, but I think it's probably trying to play up the nature of vice, right? To play up the evil in Hyde. And obviously, just going around murdering and raping people is a kind of a simplified juvenile way to look at evil, but it is the 90s, so you got to take that into account. So in the only jungle element to appear in the entire 6-issue arc, Tarzan teams up with a gorilla to hunt down Hyde. And so here's what Hyde looks like when they find him. And so this version of Hyde is about the size of Tarzan, and he has Jekyll talking to him the entire time in his head. So this first issue where they just look for Hyde I found to be kind of boring, but the second part is devoted entirely to Tarzan and the gorilla fighting Hyde. And the artist can actually draw a really good gorilla, and by the way, the gorilla's name is Kovad, which sounds kind of funny in hindsight. And so something really strange happened with this issue. Between the issue-long fight with Hyde and the gorilla, I actually ended up enjoying it. This is actually a decent Tarzan comic. It only took us 5 issues to get there, but the final part of this story arc was actually worth picking up. One interesting thing I wanted to point out was that in the novel, when Jekyll transforms into Hyde, it happens instantaneously. It's almost like magic, like a werewolf or the Incredible Hulk transforming. And that would be something that would be kind of outside the realm of something that you would see in a Burroughs novel, or at least any that I've ever read. In this story, that doesn't happen, at least not that we see. He's Hyde the entire time. Jekyll exists as a voice in his head that at some point can take him over, right? And when Jekyll takes over Hyde, it's just Jekyll controlling his actions and the words coming out of his mouth. And that's it. We don't see any physical transformation. And so I thought that was kind of interesting, maybe a way to kind of incorporate Jekyll and Hyde, but still keep, kind of Burroughs's more grounded scientific sensibilities. And so what did I think of the story arc overall now that I've read all of it? So let me play devil's advocate first. So first of all, there's certainly a crossover between Tarzan and fans of all the literary monsters that he fought. And all of those characters have had a tremendous impact on pop culture, right? All of those characters have launched tens of thousands of new characters in the last 100 years that have been in millions of different stories. And even beyond that, just words and names from those works have become so recognizable in our culture, right? For instance, the rock band Hellstorm came out with a song called Mrs. Hyde. And before I even heard it, I knew it was going to be about Lizzie Hyde singing about her dark side because I just know the term Mr. Hyde, even though I've never read the novel or watched a movie about it or anything like that. Same thing goes with Frankenstein or the term I've created a monster. We just know what it is. It's just that ingrained in our culture. And as far as my issues with it, the execution of the stories, and one thing I didn't mention is that unlike the first two plot lines, there's no real orientation to the reader about who Tarzan is. And in my opinion, that really needed to be in these stories, just like it had been in the earlier plot lines. But that being said, my opinion on the execution of the stories is just that. It's very subjective. Some people are going to like these stories, some people aren't. But I think the main thing that gets me still to this day is this. American comics are put out on a monthly basis. So when you have a 6-issue story arc, right, that is 6 months, half of a year of a jungle adventure series with no jungle in it. I think these stories could have made good fan fiction. They could have been good short stories in an anthology, or maybe good filler issues, right? Maybe each of them could have been a single filler issue between plot lines. But if we were going to take half a year of a Tarzan series for them, I am really shocked that the editor didn't go to the writer and say, hey, I appreciate your enthusiasm. I think you have some interesting ideas, but we're doing a jungle adventure series, so could you set at least part of the story or all of the story in the jungle? But the cool thing about the Dark Horse Tarzan series was that each plot line was completely different than the last. And so I did come back for the next plot line, and my recollection was it was quite badass. And so we'll be taking a look at that in my next retro review. Like and subscribe for more videos. And until next time, see ya.